Good afternoon, or in your time zone, good morning, and welcome to this offering in the college celebration of Gay Pride Week. I have chosen to speak about the Cult of Antinous, a subject of considerable interest that is obviously connected with the subject of all-male sex, but which touches in various ways on the general history of late antiquity. This is rather fortunate, I hope you'll agree. 3 hours have been set aside for this lecture, and it would tax even my ability to ramble without end if I were to speak for 3 hours just about sex. But we shall see how much time I can fill up. Be assured, there will be time for your own questions and observations. I'll begin with these fine pictures of the two most important persons in our story. On the left is Hadrian, on the right Antinous. One of the nice things about digital photography, and there are many, is that you can take a picture in a museum and then remove from it the entire background. No more trying to ignore the other exhibits in the background, or the other visitors staring at you, or something else in frozen concentration. Yes, everything else can be stripped out, leaving just what you wanted to show, neither more nor less. I took these as a single picture a few weeks ago on one of my nowadays infrequent visits to the British Museum. I was giving a lecture there at another institution where I work, this time in person. But as said, Hadrian is on the left, Antinous on the right. Hadrian is in the foreground and somewhat larger, though for reasons that will become plain, I propose to focus mainly on Antinous, not, I'll say now, on the living boy from Bithynia, whoever he might have been, but on Antinous the god. This opening having been made, I must, for my sake and yours, proceed to a warning. You'll surely have seen this in the email we sent when you signed up for the lecture. In case you haven't, I will now take you through it. Please be aware that other civilizations frequently have, or had, views of sexual propriety different from our own. This lecture will discuss, and sometimes show depictions of, sexual relationships between adults and persons somewhat below the present age of consent. Some of these relationships involve disparities of legal status. Though not recommended for imitation in modern England, or indeed in Canada, such relationships are nowhere explicitly condemned. The lecture will also not avoid language that many may consider indelicate or obscene. Now to the words in red. Oh, sorry, I haven't updated them since I first gave this lecture yesterday in England, but here they are. If you feel that you'll be offended by anything that follows, please leave this session now and ask for a refund of your fee. For the avoidance of doubt, there is no fee. You know that, don't you? This is a free lecture, included as one of the many extras in your course. But I hope you get the general idea that this may not be a lecture for everyone to enjoy. Or let's assume that you are all here to enjoy the sex. This lecture is not really about sex. Oh, sex does come into it, of course it does. It would be impossible to talk about such a subject without mentioning sexual matters, but sex will not be the primary focus. Even so, if you do believe that you'll be offended or even upset by anything that I may say, you should leave now, because the next time I show the picture on the right hand of the slide, that rather festive pink dot will have been removed. Well, since you are all still here, let us begin with the known or probable facts. And notice that I've said known or probable. If we were to take just the known facts, the information on this slide would be even briefer than it is. But here is what we can believe with good reason to know. Hadrian, or Publius Aelius Hadrianus, was born in 76 AD in Spain. He was a descendant of settlers there from Rome, or at least from Italy. His father was a cousin of the Emperor Trajan, who reigned between 98 and 117 AD. He accompanied Trajan on his victorious war against Parthia, which briefly extended Roman power to the Persian Gulf and the shores of the Indian Ocean. On Trajan's death, Hadrian succeeded to the purple and spent much of his reign travelling the empire. Indeed, he was hardly ever in Rome. Even when he was in Italy, he ruled from his immense villa at Tivoli, around 20 miles northeast of Rome. Because we can trace his movements by the laws he issued, or by the issue of coins in the relevant places, we know that he arrived in the city of Claudiopolis in Bithynia in June 123 AD. This was in what is now north-central Turkey, roughly equidistant between Ankara and the Black Sea. There he almost certainly met Antinous, who had been born around 111 AD and who was now 11 or 12. The boy's origins and status are unknown, though the silence of our sources does suggest that he came from a free and respectable family. The two probably became lovers at once. If not at once, they became lovers sometime thereafter. With reasonable certainty, we can say that the boy left Claudiopolis with the emperor, whose travels he now shared. They arrived in Egypt in the autumn of 130 AD. After spending time in Alexandria and in a lion hunt, more of which later, they began a journey up the Nile. On or about the 24th of October 130, Antinous died. He was at once declared by Hadrian and by the priests of Osiris to be a god. The city of Antinopolis was founded and built at or near the place where he died. The cult of the new god Antinous, the cult of the last pagan god of antiquity, spread rapidly through at least the eastern provinces of the empire, of the Roman Empire, and there was an active worship of Antinous that continued for the next 250 years, until the final extinction of paganism sometime after 391 AD. And that is what we know, or that is what we can with reasonable certainty infer from the sources. Everything else is a little doubtful, or at the least open to question. Here's a map of the Roman Empire as it was at the accession of Hadrian in 117 AD. In the northeast of the empire, you can see Claudiopolis. In the southeast of the empire, in Egypt, you can see Antinopolis. I will come back to this map. It's an important part of what we shall do today. As I keep saying, you can't do history without maps. History without at least one map is very like a string of pearls without the string. So here is a map. I will come back to it. I'll make the slides available to you. Of course, you will pay close attention to this map and any other map that I supply. Here are some images of Antinous. I'm showing these for a number of reasons. First, the lecture is about Antinous, and I might as well show what he looked like. Second, and this is regardless of anyone's inclinations, he was an astonishingly beautiful young man, and I can only feel sorry for anyone who finds it embarrassing to look at him. Third, and most relevant I think, an immense castle of supposition of who he was and what he was has been built on some very questionable assumptions drawn from looking at these images. And there are many, many, many images of Antinous. If you look at the whole remaining portrait art of the ancient world, surviving images of Antinous are, I believe, outnumbered only by those of Augustus and of Hadrian. If you go to any of the main classical museums, you'll find images of Antinous. There was a time when they were hidden away, and Royston Lambert, whose book I give in the bibliography at the end of these slides, complained in the early 1980s that almost none of the images was on display. Times are altered, and Antinous today is everywhere. He's on display in the British Museum, in the Ashmolean Museum, in the Cambridge Archaeological Museum, in the Louvre, in the various Roman and Greek museums, in the Metropolitan in New York. You really will have trouble avoiding Antinous if you go into any substantial collection of classical art. Here are 3 images of him. The central one was found at Hadrian's villa at Tivoli, and that is an image to which I will return. Of the other images, the one on the left was found at Delphi in 1894, and it was found still standing where it was set up, or still standing where it had been thrown down and then set up again. We don't know exactly what happened, but the image is still standing. The image was still standing, apparently where it had been set up again, sometime before the final closure and abandonment of Delphi. Here are 2 more images. Oh, and here's another, the same image from different angles. This is one of the most famous images of Antinous, the Antinous Mondragone. And except for a long interval in the 20th century, when it was seen as an embarrassment, it has been one of the most celebrated exhibits in the Louvre, one of those celebrated exhibits in the Louvre since Napoleon's looting tour of Italy first took it to Paris. But let's go back to the Delphi Antinous. Here is what the archaeologist who found it said. The body is young and beautiful. Its elegance is equalled by its force. Its flesh is so supple that it seems to be alive and to pulse, and the chest seems to swell with a healthy and powerful breath. The shoulders are as wide as those of an athlete, but they fill out with softness. The legs are fine and of a charming shape. The head, encircled by a branch from under which the curls of hair harmoniously frame the face, inclines to the side with a grace that is not without a sadness, and the eye under the shadow of the brow has a bit of melancholy. Here we have an influential expression of a view common in the 19th and 20th centuries of who Antinous was and of what he was. There were, until fairly recently, 3 fixed views of young males who let themselves be subject to the sexual attention of older males. There was the rapacious rent boy. "Here, mister, I've seed your face in the newspapers. It'll cost you extra, now and forever." That, mind you, is from imagination, not from memory, I should say. There was the mincing effeminate with shrill womanly voice. There was the ashamed victim of abuse. Since Antinous was obviously not in the first of these classes, he had somehow to be pushed into one or both of the other 2. The general preference was to put him in the last. Therefore, all the talk about his dreamy, melancholy expression. The emperor raped him every night. The only surprise is that he waited so long in shame and sadness before jumping into the Nile. But do try to look at these images without preconceptions. Here on the left is the face of the Delphi Antinous. On the right is an image from Hadrian's villa. This last, I suggest, shows a rather intelligent young man looking at us with polite interest on his face. The Delphi head seems to be staring down with a look of concentration at something in one of the missing hands. I see nothing melancholy. I see nothing ashamed. We should put aside the views prevailing between the late 19th century and a time within living memory and see the boy through our own eyes. We must look past the castle of speculation built on these images, and this is an important part of what I want to discuss this afternoon, or what I want to discuss this morning, forgive me. Before passing on, however, have another look at the hair. I used to see it as artless or even untidy, but I showed some of these images a while ago to my wife's hairdresser. She told me that producing that arrangement would take a long time and be very expensive. She said something about undercutting and layering. I promptly forgot what she said, but you don't imitate that hair by running about on a windy day, be assured of that. To those willing to look and those willing to understand what they see, that hair projects power and unlimited wealth. So those are your images of Antinous. I will come back to them. I will come back repeatedly to some of them. But here are the questions that we need to discuss. The first is ancient views of all male sex. Of course, we need to look at those. We then need to ask, who was Antinous? How did he die? How widespread was his cult? Why did it persist so long? Then, right at the end, I'd like briefly to discuss how was he seen in later ages. Some of these questions are harder to answer than others. On some of them, I want to spend rather more time than on others, but let's begin. I'll begin with ancient views of all male sex. Here is a picture from an Etruscan pot of the 6th century BC. This is on display in the baths of Diocletian. For reasons I don't think I have any need to explain, it went on display only recently. It seems to show the ancient world as a time of unlimited sexual diversity. You may choose to celebrate this, you may choose to condemn it. In either case, you'll be wrong. At no time in any of the main ancient civilizations was group oral and anal sex respectable, nor was having sex with dogs. I can't say what this image really shows beyond the sexual acts, or why it was produced. It may be a sneer at how slaves are imagined to behave, or at the ways of some barbarian people, or it may have been commissioned by someone with a strange sense of humour. It may be a gross libel on persons who would have been recognised at the time. Whatever the provenance of this pot, I do assure you that this image does not represent any respectable or even tolerated sexual ideal in any of the main ancient civilizations. The ancients didn't share many of our own present or recent sexual prejudices. This is not to say that they were without prejudices of their own. They had perhaps as many sexual prejudices as we have, or had until recently, but these were often different prejudices, and identifying and analysing these has, for the past half-century or so, been a most fertile and indeed entertaining area of classical studies. There is no reasonable doubt that Hadrian and Antinous had sex. There were 19th century writers who produced long arguments to the effect that this love between an older and a younger male was pure and completely unsullied by considerations of the flesh. We, of course, can put such arguments completely out of mind. Of course they had sex, and they probably had sex when Antinous was only 11. Everyone in the ancient world assumed without question they had been lovers. I see no reason for denying that probable fact. I also see no reason for passing judgment on it. We have our views of sexual propriety, and for the avoidance of doubt, I don't propose to question these. Equally, the ancients had their views of sexual propriety. According to these views, or according to the mainstream views within their civilization, neither party acted improperly when Hadrian went to bed with Antinous. I will during this lecture pass judgment on Hadrian. I will pass decidedly harsh judgment, but this is for a matter on which he was judged harshly at the time, or was open to harsh judgment. For the moment, I'll return to the matter in hand, which is that the ancients lacked our categories of sexual orientation, and they lacked a fixed age of consent. For the past few hundred years, we've taken a binary view of sexual orientation. Someone is gay or straight, add whatever names of your preference in place of that. Someone is gay or straight. We do allow for bisexuality, but we'll generally resolve this in our own minds by asking if a bisexual is more gay or more straight. We have also tended, during the past 1,000 years or so, to regard certain acts as in themselves moral or immoral. Neither the Greeks nor the Romans had this binary view. Until a long time after the establishment of Christianity, neither Greek nor Latin had specific words to express an undivided orientation towards all male or all female or mixed sex. There were simply acts that were considered proper or improper depending on the attendant circumstances. It was a man's duty, so far as he was able, to marry and to beget children. His duty was to continue the bloodline laid down by his ancestors. He had a duty also to the wider community of which he was a member, and given high rates of infant mortality and endemic warfare, all ancient populations hovered at least on the edge of decline. A man's duty, again so far as he was able, was to contribute to a new generation of citizens and of soldiers. If ability was lacking, his duty was to adopt and raise the surplus children of others, his less fortunate relatives perhaps. Now, these duties being discharged, what else he did in private was his own business. If he pursued his interests in public, what he did might attract condemnation. It might even attract official condemnation. But condemnation did not follow from considerations of gender or the nature of the relevant acts. It followed, as I've said, from considerations of the attendant circumstances. And these attendant circumstances were entirely a matter of who penetrated whom. Here, we need to make a distinction between Athens and Rome. Athens, I grant, doesn't stand for the whole of Greece, nor for any part of Greece during its long history. And what I say about Rome doesn't stand for Rome during the whole of its own long history. But the places and times I will now discuss are relevant to our understanding of the relationship between Hadrian and Antinous. I'll make the general point that it was considered normal in most ancient societies for an adult male to be sexually attracted to younger males as well as to women. It was so normal that it was barely worth noting. Again, however, sexual activity between males was constrained by considerations of the attendant circumstances. And to see what I mean by attendant circumstances, let's look at Athens. Let's look in the first instance at Athens. Here, during the classical period, it was expected that an adult male, or an erastes, would form a close union of affection with a boy, an eromenos, a boy between the ages of about 11 and 17. These males would share the same social status, or the erastes would be of slightly higher status. In this union, the erastes would give training in the martial skills, he would give training in the adult proprieties of their class, and in what we might call the wider humanities. He would help to manage the boy's transition from boyhood to maturity. The eromenos, or the beloved, would oblige the erastes sexually. This obligation was supposed to be confined to nothing more penetrative than intercrural sex, or intercourse between closed thighs. Nothing oral, nothing anal was permitted. No doubt there was both oral and anal sex, and the older was not always the active party. Human beings do what they do in private, and these doings will not necessarily be confined to what others think proper. But this was not supposed to happen. No oral, no anal. It was thought disgraceful for a free boy to submit to any act of penetration. There is a story given in Aristotle's Politics of Periander. He was apparently killed by his eromenos, or his boy lover, after poking him in the stomach one day at dinner and asking why he wasn't yet pregnant. The boy was so outraged that he immediately joined a conspiracy against the tyrant. A free man who was known to have submitted to penetration, oral or anal, was an object of public ridicule and was barred from public life. Slaves and foreigners were fair game. They could be penetrated by a citizen. For this reason, prostitutes of either sex were supposed to be slaves or foreigners. Again, though, a citizen was not supposed to be penetrated by them. But this is a digression. What matters for us at the moment is that once the eromenos reached puberty and began to grow a beard, the sexual relationship was supposed to end. Though they would remain close friends through the rest of their lives, the eromenos would now himself become the erastes of a younger male, so the chain would continue. If we now turn to Rome, free boys of any social status were barred from taking any kind of passive role with older men. If a boy was known to have engaged in sex with an older male, he was subject in later life to the legal penalty of stuprum. This wasn't because the Romans had a prejudice against all male sex. What they abhorred was any sexual act in which a citizen took the passive role. There was nothing then among the Romans corresponding to the Athenian relationship of erastes and eromenos. Instead, Roman citizens were expected to form relationships with slaves or foreigners. These, as ever, were fair game. There was also a loose toleration of continuing sexual relationships with freed slaves. Even though these were now Roman citizens, the consideration here, though, was that the penetrator was supposed to be of higher status. So not the gender of the parties, not necessarily the acts in themselves, but a question of who was penetrating whom. The Greeks and the Romans both had an obsession with this, though it showed itself in different ways. Following from this, there was no prejudice among the Romans against all male sex, where both parties were adults. All that mattered was who was believed to be penetrating whom. And here are two examples of this kind of relationship. The first is Sulla the dictator. He had a long sexual relationship with Metrobius, a Greek actor, an actor, and therefore a man of low social status. The second is the Emperor Galba, who had a long sexual relationship with his freedman, Icelus, a freedman, a man also of low social status. No one appears to have made any issue of these relationships. As a contrast, though, we have the alleged relationship between Julius Caesar and King Nicomedes of Bithynia. Caesar was greatly mocked for this, not because of the sex with another man, but because he was alleged to have taken the passive role. He was sometimes called the Queen of Bithynia. Here are two somewhat unusual images, or perhaps here are two somewhat shocking images so far as our modern sensibilities are concerned. Their purpose is to illustrate the distinction between the Athenian and the Roman ideal. The ideal, not the reality, mind you. On the left, you'll see that the older male is in a state of, shall we say, considerable excitement. The boy, however, is not. The boy's not frightened, he's not outraged, he's showing no reluctance to engage in some kind of sexual act with the older male, but he's not sexually excited. Again, how realistic this image is, I leave to your imagination, but this was the Athenian ideal. On the right is a Roman brothel token. You can see here that the male prostitute who is fellating his client is himself excited. No one's supposed to think ill of this, so long as he remains the recipient. So there you have a distinction between the two ideals. The reality must have been different. The reality must sometimes, or perhaps often, have been different. We know that the reality often was different, but these were the public ideals, and these form the background to the relationship between Hadrian and Antinous. According to the most respectable Greek ideal, the emperor could take Antinous as a lover while he remained a boy. According to the Roman ideal, the emperor could have Antinous at any age, so long as he was known as the penetrator. Let us now turn to what we know about the life of Antinous, and what we know can be given in the two lines marked in red in the history of Dio Cassius, written over a century after the events in question. Antinous was from Bithynion, a city of Bithynia, which we also call Claudiopolis. He had been a favourite of the emperor, and that is about all we know of Antinous. We know nothing about his social status, we know nothing about his ancestry, we know nothing about his family, we know nothing about he and Hadrian met. We know very little about the nature of their relationship while Antinous was alive. We may know a little more than these lines give, but it isn't that much more. But on top of these two lines, you have a vast mass of conjecture. You start by making assumptions about how Hadrian and Antinous met. Once you make those, you take them as a certainty. On top of them, you place another assumption. You take that as a certainty. And that's ready for more assumptions until you have an entire castle of biography, of entirely fanciful biography. The materials of this castle are the words could have, must have, may have, we may suppose, and so forth. Royston Lambert, whose book is worth reading, was particularly good at this, and this is a temptation that we should try to avoid, and I will, with one or two lapses, endeavour to do my absolute best to avoid this temptation. There is, nevertheless, something more we can say about Antinous. There is the lion hunt. On the top right of this slide, not shown in much or well-preserved detail, may be Antinous. The image is taken from the Arch of Constantine in Rome. He reigned 200 years after the birth of Antinous, but when celebrating his own rule as emperor, he seems to have cannibalized much decoration from earlier monuments. The man with elaborate hair may be Antinous, probably is Antinous. There's no doubt Hadrian is in the foreground, and the whole image commemorates a lion hunt. We can add to this a probable extract from a poem by Pancrates, an Alexandrian. We know that Pancrates read a poem to Hadrian in Alexandria about a lion hunt outside Alexandria, and that he paid several compliments in this to Antinous, and that Hadrian was very pleased by it. For the main text of the poem, we have a fragmentary papyrus extract found in Egypt. There's no certainty of identification, though the probabilities are that we do have an extract of what Pancrates read to Hadrian. Part of it goes, "Such was the steed whereon Antinous sat in wait for the deadly lion, holding in his left hand the bridle rein, and in his right a spear tipped with adamant. First Hadrian, his brass-fitted spear, wounded the beast, but slew him not. For a purpose he missed the mark, wishing to test to the full the sureness of aim of his lovely Antinous, son of the Argus slayer." Assuming this is the poem read by Pancrates, we have some addition here to a biography of Antinous, and even some grounds for not completely worthless speculation on the nature of his relationship with Hadrian. The two arrived together in Alexandria. From here, they went together into the desert and hunted a lion. They went back to Alexandria and were greeted as heroes. From here, they began their journey up the Nile. These are reasonably certain facts. We can further assume, given that Antinous was now at least 17, that Hadrian was making some effort to conform to the Athenian ideal of managing the boy's transition to manhood. We know that Hadrian was a lover of everything Greek. He was the first emperor to wear a beard in the Greek style. We have some grounds for this assumption. On the other hand, he may have been following the looser Roman ideal, but I will say more about this later. Since this is about all we can say about his life, I turn to the death of Antinous. For this we have the Historia Augusta, written sometime in the 4th century, and, to put it mildly, of very dubious provenance and accuracy. Though not entirely to be trusted, the biography of Hadrian appears to have been put together with some attention to genuine sources, which are now lost. It says, "He lost Antinous, his favourite, during a voyage along the Nile, and he wept for him like a woman." Or we have Dio Cassius again. "He died in Egypt by falling into the Nile," as Hadrian writes. So he died by drowning in the Nile. It grows less certain again once we turn to the circumstances of the drowning. The main sources suggest a ritual suicide followed by a cover-up. Here is Dio Cassius quoted at greater length. "Antinous died in Egypt, either by falling into the Nile, as Hadrian writes, or, as the truth is, by being offered in sacrifice. For Hadrian, as I have stated, was always very curious and employed divinations and incantations of all kinds. Accordingly, he honoured Antinous, either because of his love for him, or because the youth had voluntarily undertaken to die, it being necessary that her life should be surrendered freely for the accomplishment of the ends Hadrian had in view." Here again is the Historia Augusta. There are varying rumours about this person, some asserting that he had devoted himself to death for Hadrian's sake. Here is Aurelius Victor, a writer from late in the 4th century. "When Hadrian wanted to prolong his life, and magicians had demanded a volunteer in his place, they report that although everyone else refused, Antinous offered himself. We shall leave the matter unresolved." Since this is what the sources say, what can we say that avoids the usual breathless fantasy surrounding the death of Antinous? It may have been an accident. People do fall out of boats, and the Nile is an often horrible river. Or it is possible that the boy, now reaching manhood, was depressed about his future. Perhaps Hadrian was losing sexual interest and was looking for someone younger. Imperial courts can be cruel places, but this is not supported by the Lion Hunt poem. As said, Hadrian seems to be moving from Erastes to close friend. As for Antinous, barely a fortnight before he died, he had been chasing that lion round the Egyptian desert, horse reins in one hand, a hunting spear in the other. Not quite the vision of some effeminate weakling scared of the dark hairs sprouting on his upper lip. Or take a proper look at the images. For myself, I see a happy and intelligent boy on the edge of manhood. Perhaps there were misunderstandings, perhaps there was an argument, perhaps these were followed by suicide, but I do prefer the insistent rumours of a ritual suicide. This being so, I agree with the ancient historians in thinking little good of Hadrian. When an absolute ruler calls for one, there is no such thing as a purely willing volunteer. Antinous seems to have been a victim of at least undue influence. Whatever we think of this relationship, Hadrian was the older party. He had a duty of care to the boy, a duty of care to send his astrologers and soothsayers out of the room and to give emphatic instructions that if a victim must be found, it should not, in any circumstances, be Antinous. Instead, the body was fished out of that river, and that city built near the spot went up with suspicious speed. I find that more telling than claims that he sobbed like a woman after the death. But let's move to what happened after the death. According to the Historia Augusta, the Greeks, following Hadrian's wish, consecrated him as a god. Aurelius Victor agrees, so writing at greater length does Dio Cassius. Building a city on the spot where he had suffered this fate, and naming it after him, he also set up statues, or rather sacred images of him, practically all over the world. Finally, he declared that he had seen a star that he took to be that of Antinous. So, Antinous was the lover of the Emperor Hadrian. He died at about the age of 18 by falling into the Nile or by jumping into the Nile, or if you want to take a dark view of Hadrian, you can say that he did everything short of pushing him into the Nile and holding him there. Whatever did happen on the Nile, Antinous was afterwards declared a god, and everything followed from that. So let's move to the question of his deification. It sounds rather strange to us that a living person after his or her death can be declared a god, but this was not greatly unusual in the ancient world, not common, but far from unknown. It was possible for individuals to be deified by formal act of the competent authorities. Romulus and Julius Caesar, for example, were declared by the Roman Senate to be gods after their deaths. Augustus was also formally declared a god after his death by the Senate. And many other Roman emperors, not all of them to be sure, but many of them, were deified. There is no evidence that Antinous received a formal grant of divinity from the Senate. There is no evidence that Hadrian bothered asking for one. It may have been an act of sovereign power by the emperor himself. It was now a century and a half after the Augustan settlement, and the emperors, even without flaunting their command of the legions and of the administration, were beginning to trespass on the law-making power granted by Augustus and Tiberius to the Senate. Almost anything the Senate could do, the emperor could also do of his own motion. It may have been enough for Hadrian to stamp a document, and that was that. Antinous was now a god. or it may have been an informal deification in which everyone round the emperor took the lead in declaring what everyone knew he wanted them to believe, and perhaps what he wanted to believe. Indeed, Antinous died during the festival of Osiris. The priests of Osiris held that anyone who drowned in the Nile was a kind of demigod who could look forward to a physical resurrection. That may have been the excuse that Hadrian, or those in his court, used for making this an apparently spontaneous deification. We can be sure, though, that this was an immediate deification. It wasn't something that waited for several months. That new city of Antinopolis was begun within days of the death, and it seems fair to believe that the foundation coincided or even followed the deification. It's also obvious that the new cult spread rapidly through at least the Greek-speaking areas of the empire. The earliest surviving pagan testimony is from Pausanias, who wrote a guidebook to Greece and published sometime before his death, around 180 AD. He says, "Antinous too was considered by them to be a god. His temple is the newest in Mantinea. He was a great favourite of the Emperor Hadrian. I never saw him while he was among mortals, but I have seen his image in statues and in paintings. He has honours in other places as well, and on the Nile there is an Egyptian city named after Antinous. He is worshipped in Mantinea for the following reason. Antinous was by birth from Bithynia beyond the river Sangarius, and the Bithynians are by descent Arcadians of Mantinea. For these reasons, the emperor also established his worship in Mantinea. Mystic rites are celebrated annually and games every 4 years. There's a building in the gymnasium of Mantinea with statues of Antinous. It is remarkable for the stones with which it is adorned and the paintings on display. Many of the paintings are of Antinous, most in the likeness of Dionysus." We then have the city of Antinopolis. As said, it was founded by Hadrian less than a week after the death of Antinous, and it was established near the place where Antinous died. All the previous buildings in the existing settlement there were demolished, though the temple of Ramesses II was left in place. The new city of Hadrian was built on the standard Hellenistic grid plan and given its own governing institutions and the status of a provincial capital. It had a good harbour on the Nile, and it was connected to the Red Sea ports by a road that took 6 years to build and established the city as an obvious trading centre. Greeks were encouraged to move there by offers of generous tax relief. Egyptian settlers were also welcome, and Antinopolis was one of the few places in Egypt where native Egyptians were not required to make themselves into passable Greeks by acculturation before marrying Greeks. Antinous may have been buried there, though his mummy may have been taken back to Italy for burial in the imperial villa in Tivoli. Certainly Antinopolis was home to the annual Antinoia, or cult games of Antinous. These were held first in 131 AD, perhaps a year after the death. These were mainly athletic competitions, but also involved chariot and horse races and performances of music and poetry. The prizes, those were notably generous: citizenship of Antinopolis, Roman citizenship, money, and lifetime maintenance at the public expense. Because of its natural location and the artificial incentives given to its growth, the city remained prominent until the Arab conquest of the 7th century, after which it was abandoned and left to fall into ruin. Much of it still survived in the 1790s when the French invaded Egypt, and most of what we know of Antinopolis is from the drawings and the plans made by the French scholars. Unfortunately, most of the city was demolished during the 19th century. Its materials were made into cement for a local factory. Almost nothing of the city survives today, which is a great loss. In the 1790s, the French all agreed that it was a city very well preserved and of great elegance. A greater loss, perhaps, is the mountain of papyrus scrolls dug out of the libraries for processing into fertilizer, again in the 19th century. I can't say what loss that represents, but life is often a matter of losses. Turning back to the spread of the cult, the consensus of opinion is that Antinous was worshipped mainly in the eastern provinces of the empire. There is, however, evidence of some presence in the west. We have an inscription of 133 AD from a temple established at Lanuvium, about 20 miles from Rome. We have a temple in the Danubian provinces built by the adopted son and intended successor of Hadrian. There's evidence of a scattered worship in Italy and Spain and North Africa. In the early 20th century, a coin of Antinous was dug up in England, though one coin hardly proves an established worship. There's evidence of an active continuing worship in more than 70 cities throughout the empire. Most of these cities, though, were in the east, and Greek was their working language. There are 28 distinct temples, and there are 31 cities known to have issued coins bearing the head of Antinous. 6 of these cities held periodic games in his honour. Antinous was soon established as a deity moving between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld, answering prayers and curing diseases. He also was seen as a protector of travellers and as a supervisor of the harvests. He was worshipped as a god in his own right and as a god associated with other gods. On the generality of this tendency, I will quote Gibbon. The policy of the emperors and the Senate, as far as it concerned religion, was happily seconded by the reflections of the Enlightenment and by the habits of the superstitious part of their subjects. The various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful. And thus toleration produced not only mutual indulgence, but even religious concord. As ever, Gibbon wrote this with a careful eye on the line beyond which he might risk a prosecution for blasphemy, but it is a good account of ancient syncretism. The ancient gods were always rather plastic, based on common attributes or common functions. A local god would be associated with a more senior god. The senior gods of different peoples would be merged into common gods. Names would be compounded, or as we see it, hyphenated together. There was obviously the conflation of the Greek and Roman pantheons, where Jupiter was taken as an alternative name for Zeus, and so forth. There was, for example, the compounding of a local British goddess as Minerva Sulis, and worshippers of each would worship the other. Or there was the compounding of the Egyptian sun god Ammon-Ra, itself I think a compound, with Zeus as Zeus Ammon, whose oracle at Siwa was visited by Greeks and Romans and Egyptians alike. So it was with Antinous. Here is a bust of Antinous Osiris, or Osirantinous, in the Louvre. It's in a stiff Egyptianizing style, though the hair and broad chest tell you at once who it is. And here are other associations, some obvious, some deduced and argued over. We have Antinous again as Osiris, Antinous as Dionysus, Antinous as Apollo, And there is the head of the image found in Delphi in 1894. On the right you have Antinous as Hercules. At the bottom of the slide there is Antinous yet again as Osiris. I won't say how that identification was made, but it was made by people who know a great deal more about ancient iconography than I do, and I'll live with the identification. So, Antinous was a god in his own right. He was Antinous the god, but he was also associated, for various reasons of convenience, with other gods, and he shared the attributes of those gods. Here is the Pincian obelisk in Rome. It seems in the first instance to have been placed by Hadrian at his villa in Tivoli. It may have been put above the tomb of Antinous, though this is only a possibility. I'm told the obelisk was not produced in Egypt, but in Italy, or perhaps in Rome. It was made by Egyptian craftsmen, but they were working from a translation into Egyptian of a Greek text, which was probably written by Hadrian himself. The obelisk is damaged at its base, and the Egyptian is difficult to read, even when it's possible to see the hieroglyphs. But it does seem to say, or parts of it do seem to confirm, what I've just said. Osir Antinous the Justified, he became a youth with a beautiful face that delighted the eyes, strength from clever heart like one with strong arms. He received an order of the gods at the time of his passing. All uses of the hours of Osiris were repeated in him, including all of his passing. All uses of the hours of Osiris were repeated in him, including all his work as a mystery. The English is odd, and don't ask me what it means exactly, but so I'm told is the Egyptian. Greek and Egyptian don't easily align as languages, and this result doesn't easily align with English. I checked this translation against what I'm told is an authoritative French translation by Jean-Claude Grenier. It still makes limited sense, or rather it makes no sense to me. So what it may have said in Greek is open to argument. But another part that survives in a continuous stretch is: Antinous goes from his city to many temples in the whole country, and he hears the requests of those who pray to him, and he heals the needy ill by sending them a dream. He completes his work amongst the living. He takes on every form which his heart desires. The true seed of the god is in his limbs. All gods and goddesses give him the breath of life, and he breathes as one rejuvenated. That's something to which I will return. It's something I regard as of considerable importance. For the moment, here's a photograph of the obelisk as it is in Rome. To my discredit, I overlooked this when I walked by it many years ago. I glanced at the inscription, but it commemorates the re-erection of the obelisk by Pius VII in 1822, and just shortly before anyone could know what it really was. Reasons for the spreading worship of Antinous. Why did this cult spread as it did? That's a good question. Before I press on with that, there's a fine picture on the right of a fine image of Antinous. And this is the Antinous Braschi. I saw this in the Vatican Museum many years ago and took several pictures, but I took them with an early digital camera, and none of them came out as well as what I found on Wikipedia. Fine picture, fine image. But let's go back to the spread of the cult. The pagan and Christian writers seem to be agreed on the cause of its spread. Here's Justin Martyr, a Christian, writing not long after the death. We do not think it out of place at this point to mention Antinous, who was recently alive and whom everyone with fear began to worship as a god, although they knew who he was and where he was from. Or we have the Historia Augusta, already quoted more than once. In fact, the Greeks, following Hadrian's wish, consecrated him as a god. They claim oracles were given through him, Hadrian himself is talked about as their author. Then we have Athanasius, the great defender of the Trinity against Arius and his followers, writing in the 4th century, that is Bishop Athanasius, a Christian writer. Antinous, favourite of Hadrian, Emperor of the Romans, whom, although men knew he was a mere man, and not a respectable man, but on the contrary full of licentiousness, yet they worship for fear of him that enjoined it. For Hadrian, having come to sojourn in the land of Egypt, when Antinous, the minister of his pleasures, died, ordered him to be worshipped, being himself in love with the youth even after his death, but for all that offering a convincing exposure of himself and a proof against all idolatry, that it was discovered among men for no other reason than by reason of the lust of them that imagined it. Then we have a strange and almost passing remark quoted in Eusebius, who wrote that great history of the church in the 4th century. It's quoted from a much earlier writer called Hegesippus. They made cenotaphs and shrines to them up to the present. Among them is Antinous, a slave of the Emperor Hadrian, in whose honour the Antinoian Games are held, although he was our contemporary. For he, Hadrian, also built a city named for Antinous and appointed prophets. From that casual remark, many people have tried to argue that Antinous was a slave boy of the emperor, and he may have been, although I find it unlikely. The Greeks and Romans were prepared to worship another human being if they were told to by the emperor. It is unlikely, though, that they would have so willingly or gladly have worshipped a dead slave, but that is my supposition. All I'll say is that any claims that Antinous was a slave boy of Hadrian come purely from this casual remark by Eusebius in the 4th century. Now, it was until recently the consensus that Hadrian was able to order his subjects to worship the boy from Bithynia as Antinous the god, but that this was an entirely artificial cult. See, for example, Ramsay MacMullen writing in 1981. Hadrian's establishing of a new cult to honour Antinous brought the whole of his authority into play. His success was sharply limited. Compliant cities built temples, individuals put up prayers, and honorific games were staged. The games lasted. The name, however, disappeared from people's minds. Hadrian's effort, the most emphatic of several he undertook, had never struck root in the West at all. Is there evidence, however, that this was a cult that died with the man who established it? There is no such evidence. There is indeed much evidence, wholly decisive evidence, that the cult of Antinous continued long after the death of the emperor who first commanded it. At the top of this slide, you have 2 coins of Antinous. These were produced during the lifetime of Hadrian, which is, as might be expected, the emperor had commanded, or was very persuasively urging the worship of Antinous. Those cities authorized to mint coins would therefore compete to bring out the finest images of the new god. But look at the bottom coin, or medallion, I forget which it is. Whatever it is, this was produced in 384 AD. It carries an undeniably crude image of Antinous, but still proclaims him a god. If this coin says nothing about the extent of continuing worship, more than 200 years after the death, we can take it as clear evidence against the notion of a cult sustained by the will of Hadrian and defunct thereafter. We can add to this several coins from the reign of Caracalla, nearly a century after the death, also carrying the head of Antinous. Still further, we can add a small stock of literary evidence recovered from the Egyptian deserts. Here is a rhetorical exercise from around 200 AD, 70 years after the death of Antinous, and 60 after the death of Hadrian. Most important is the flower of Antinous, more pleasant than all. It is not pale like the narcissus that is pained about the abduction, nor is it pale like the hyacinth that imitates the colour of the corpse. The one who collects the wreaths of the names mourned will weep even more for the young age of the deceased. That's a papyrus fragment from Egypt around 200 AD, I repeat, about 70 years after the death of Antinous and about 60 years after the death of Hadrian. Here is part of a fragmentary poem which I believe commemorates the accession of Diocletian in 284 AD, 150 years after the death. She rejoiced to find the ransom for the life of Antinous, memorial of his hunt, palm of his victory. I revere Narcissus, your shadowy reflection. I shed a tear for Hyacinthus, who grasped the cruel discus. The nymphs began to crown their tresses with the flower named after Antinous, which to this day preserves the mighty spear of the hunter. Into the Nile he hurried for purification of the blood of the lion, but the moon with more brilliant hopes called to him to shine as a star-like bridegroom, and garlanding the new light with a circle, she took him for her husband. A city was the gift of Hadrian. It is rather fragmentary, but that appears to be what it says. And here is a love spell from Egypt, dated to about 300 AD. That is 170 years after the death. I conjure all the demons in this place to assist the demon Antinous. Rouse yourself for me and go to each place, to each neighbourhood, to each house, and bind Ptolemaeus, whom Aias bore, the daughter of Origenes, so that she should not be fucked, buggered, or should not give any pleasure to another man, except to me alone. You'll pardon the slight vulgarity of utterance in that quotation. However, this is a love spell from Egypt, pushing towards 200 years after the death, in which the name of Antinous seems very much to have been common currency. So there is no reason to doubt that the name and attributes and even the living achievements, that is the lion hunt, of Antinous remained alive for centuries after his death. If we can dismiss the more literary texts as deliberately obscure conceits, the love curse, the one with the vulgar language, the love curse can't be dismissed. It shows a continuing belief among the lower or the lowish classes of the empire in the power of Antinous. Anyone who claims that the cult of Antinous died with Hadrian is arguing without full knowledge of the evidence. I turn then to why the cult continued. Let's go back a few slides. Have another look at what Athanasius is saying. Yet they worship for fear of him that enjoined it. Something I can see that I missed from this quotation is the introductory clause, and in our own time. But you are all, or have been, in my intermediate Greek class, or perhaps you will soon be there. You can see the missing clause in the text I've pasted there, kai honun. You may also see that the verb sebusen, they worship, is in the present tense. This is a curious statement. No doubt before Hadrian's death in 138 AD, people worshipped Antinous, at least in part, because it was commanded. It was commanded by the emperor, and you do not disobey an emperor. But how likely is it that worship continued out of fear of Hadrian for the better part of 2 centuries? We could dismiss the claim as a loose utterance. The cult of Antinous put down genuine roots. There's evidence of continuing popular belief and relevance. Antinous was worshipped as a god from his death in 130 AD down to the final extinction of paganism in 391 AD. All this is true beyond reasonable doubt. At the same time, if he can be called overbearing and intolerant and lacking in the smallest atom of charity for anyone who disagreed with him, one thing Athanasius of Alexandria cannot be called is a careless writer. If Athanasius positively asserts that the worship of Antinous had some degree of official endorsement in his own day, we move closer to an explanation of the worship as a whole. Before, however, I move to this possible explanation, allow me a further digression. It is, I think, a necessary digression, though it may be a long one. And, this isn't the map I showed earlier and promised to show again. Here instead is a map of the empire that shows its more permanent borders, not the temporarily expanded borders left by Trajan. It's an empire with strong geographical logic. It includes all the shores of the populous and wealthy Mediterranean. It includes all the hinterlands from which these shores could be invaded. These hinterlands extend all the way to their natural frontiers, the Rhine and Danube in the north, the deserts in the south, the deserts and rivers to the east, and the Atlantic to the west. Beyond this logic of geography, though, its only principle of unity was that all these territories had at one time been conquered by Roman arms and were now held by a combination of Roman arms and inertia. Until rather late in its history, the empire was not an administrative unity. Though whether he ruled directly or indirectly there was little difference in practice, there was a distinction between imperial and senatorial provinces. There were the supposedly free cities within the empire, Greek city-states that is, which had never been conquered, but which were affiliated with the empire through ancient treaties of friendship. Or there was Egypt, which wasn't a Roman province at all. After the death of Cleopatra, Octavian had become pharaoh of Egypt, and that was how he and his successors ruled the country. They ruled through a viceroy in Alexandria, who was not a member of the imperial governing structure, but a personal representative of the absent pharaoh. In Alexandria and the Greek cities of Egypt, the emperor, no doubt, was just Caesar, as he was everywhere else. Outside these Greek oases, he really was Pharaoh. He was the Pharaoh of Egypt in exactly the same way as Ramesses II had been. Here's a picture of Augustus as Pharaoh, and here from over a century later is Hadrian as Pharaoh. Nothing there, you'd agree, of a Roman emperor. The ruler of Egypt is a traditional pharaoh. That's how he was presented to the ordinary native people of Egypt. Nor was the empire at any time before the Byzantine period a linguistic unity. Here's another map of the empire that shows its main linguistic division, Greek in the east, Latin in the west. But this isn't a real division. The cities were predominantly Latin or Greek. The much more populous country districts spoke many other languages, some Indo-European, many others not. There was Coptic, there was Syriac, there was Aramaic, there was Germanic and Celtic and Punic. Latin wouldn't become a common language in the West until after the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century. Greek in the East, not until the Arab conquests of Syria and Egypt. There was greater racial unity on the various shores of the Mediterranean than we nowadays see. This isn't at all to say the various ethnic groups looked to each other with any affection. There was mutual tolerance and even syncretism in religious worship, and I refer you back to that quotation from Edward Gibbon. But there were still radically different approaches to religion. This diversity of peoples could be ignored while the empire was a work in progress, until the Augustan settlement buried the Republic in the 20s BC. The empire could be seen from Rome as the city of Rome plus territories to be exploited for the benefit of the Roman people, or whatever portion of the Roman people was currently in charge of the city. It could be seen by the provincials themselves as yet another of those temporary dominions they had been suffering since time out of mind. By the 2nd century, though, after several centuries of settled rule, the empire had acquired permanency. It could, and perhaps must, increasingly be seen as an empire that just happened to have Rome as its capital. In 212 AD, Caracalla would extend Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire. Even before then, the emperors were handing out grants of citizenship to almost every community that asked politely. But a common legal citizenship is not the same as an active principle of unity. This being so, there was need of some unifying principle that went beyond past military success and present inertia, but there was no linguistic unity and there was no national unity. There was no religious unity. So what was this principle to be? For the emperors of the 2nd century, the 2nd century AD that is, the most obvious principle would be the Greek civilization of which Rome was itself the largest child. This civilization was now deep into a cultural revival from several hundred years of decadence. After about 200 BC, the Romans had seen the Greeks as the interesting and useful, but generally unworthy descendants of the classical forebears whom they themselves admired. By about 100 AD, there was a sudden revival. Growing population, expanded on new cities, an overall recovery of confidence. Now fully reconciled to the political hegemony of Rome, the Greeks were moving towards a new status as one of the joint dominant peoples of the empire. Hadrian was notable for his Greek beard and Greek ways. Marcus Aurelius, half a century later, would write his philosophical works in Greek. If there was to be a principle of unity for the empire, what else should this be but something Greek? Even so, this was in the cultural sense an artificial revival. The renewed flow of Greek literature that we see after the death of Plutarch was based on a close reading and a close imitation of the Greek classics, which had been written 400 or 500 years earlier. Plutarch himself had been happy to write in the educated Greek of his own age, which was somewhat removed from the Greek of the great Athenian writers of 400 or 500 years earlier. He was prepared to incorporate Roman words into his language when it struck him as convenient to do so, and to call foreign peoples by whatever name he found convenient. A generation after the death of Plutarch, there was a fixed prejudice among writers of Greek against the use of any word that couldn't be found in the Athenian classics. If there was a word unknown to Xenophon, or Plato, or Demosthenes, or Thucydides, that word should not be used. Now, imagine a reaction in our own day against our own spoken English. Imagine that the only writing anyone was willing to admire had to be a perfect imitation of Shakespeare, or Francis Bacon, or John Milton, or the authorized version of the Bible, and imagine that there were limited concessions to the Augustans for vocabulary. Imagine that we had to call memory sticks tally sticks, or penicillin a sovereign remedy against the contagion. The result would be a strange kind of literature. And so it was for the Greeks of the second century AD. Every so often there was a writer of genius like Lucian who made the new rules work. Mostly the result was a mass of pedantic and worthless rhetorical exercises, inflated speeches, trifling epigrams, more or less competent forgeries put out under the names of the great men from the past. Here again is Gibbon, this time on what is called the Second Sophistic, that is, this revival of Greek literature. Gibbon says this: "The love of letters, almost inseparable from peace and refinement, was fashionable among the subjects of Hadrian and the Antonines, who were themselves men of learning and curiosity. But if we accept the inimitable Lucian, this age of indolence passed away without having produced a single writer of original genius, or who excelled in the arts of elegant composition. The authority of Plato and Aristotle, of Zeno and Epicurus, still reigned in the schools, and their systems, transmitted with blind deference from one generation of disciples to another, precluded every generous attempt to exercise the powers or enlarge the limits of the human mind. A cloud of critics, of compilers, of commentators darkened the face of learning, and the decline of genius was soon followed by the corruption of taste." That's Gibbon, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, chapter 2. That may not be an entirely just opinion of the literature of the second and the later centuries, but nor is it ridiculously unjust. The Roman Empire was in need of an active principle of unity between its diverse peoples. It seems that this unifying principle was wanted to be Greek, and yet the Greek civilization to be fashioned into this principle had now shut itself into a museum. It was not something that could be used for reaching out to all the peoples of the empire. It was not even something able to contain the cultural drift of the higher classes. Here are 3 statues. On the left is a wealthy Roman of about 250 AD, though a fine and realistic portrait of its subject. It is not classical in tone. The middle statue is from the 380s and is of the Emperor Valentinian II. Again, fine as a portrait, again not classical. Then we have a judge from about 500 AD, not at all classical in its tone or style. So we see a drifting away from the classical standards, even among the higher classes, that Hadrian and his heirs and successors seem to have regarded as the most desirable of people. Then we have the growing inadequacy of the established faiths. The picture here is one that I took a few years ago in the Cambridge Archaeological Museum and is of the seated Hermes, a statue made in the 2nd century BC. You can look at this and say, oh, how very human the ancient gods were, so like ourselves, so unlike those ghastly desert gods that call for total abasement of the will. Yes, except they were bigger and lived forever. The ancient gods were just like us. They were capricious, they were vengeful, they were cruel. The stories about them are almost invariably scandalous. There is the story of Io. Zeus fell in lust with her, and I use the word lust advisedly. When his wife Hera got wind of their relationship, he turned the girl into a cow, from which various unlikely adventures began. You can try making this into some edifying allegory, but everyone knows it's a story about ungoverned lust and power. It may be an entertaining story, but will you really want to commit your immortal soul to beings like these? It is a silly question. The ancient gods had no interest in the souls of individuals. The main ancient view of religion was that each god would form a bond with a specific community. In exchange for sacrifices and other worship, the god would provide material advantages. These were collective transactions. The material advantages were to the community as a whole. If an individual gained anything, so much the better. But whatever an individual might gain was only during his life. Here's a modern painting to show how the Greeks and Romans saw the next world. They believed that the soul was immortal. All would arrive after death at the banks of the river Styx. Those not provided with the required fee would be left waiting on the near bank for 100 years. Those with the fee would be ferried across. Those very favoured by the gods would proceed to the Elysian fields, there to enjoy a jolly afterlife for all eternity. Those hated by the gods, not necessarily those who had been hateful to humanity, would be punished forever and ever. The rest, the great majority, would spend the rest of time in the indifferent vastness of the underworld. These teachings were mixed with a belief in angry and malevolent ghosts, and you can understand why they should be angry and malevolent. You can look at those statues of the gods, you can enthuse over their beauty. You really wouldn't care to worship them, as they offered nothing in return. From at least the 2nd century BC, people were looking for a more personal relationship with the gods. They were looking for some promise of personal salvation. It was now that various Eastern cults entered the Greek and Roman worlds, the cult of Isis, for example. You can see here how by the 1st or 2nd century AD, a goddess originally for the Egyptians has become a goddess for all mankind. Her cult spread because she was a protectress of all who entered the underworld. She would see that every soul came to a happy ending. There was also a limited repurposing of the existing gods into bringers of personal salvation. Dionysus, for example, many other salvation faiths, many others. Here, though, is the big one. Do I need to explain what this picture shows? I think not, but I will. It's Pilate showing Christ to the Jewish mob. Shall I spare this man or Barabbas? He is asking. I count as a Christian, but will make nothing of this. I won't ask, but suspect that most of you are not Christians. Whatever your faith, however, you have no choice but to regard this new faith as of an entirely different quality from anything that had emerged in any part of the ancient world. It began as a dissident Jewish sect. Christ was executed by the Romans as a troublemaker. Then St. Paul came along. He purged this Jewish heresy of anything inconveniently Jewish. No more funny clothing and dietary rules, no more circumcision. This done, he went on his vast evangelizing tours of the eastern provinces, bringing in tens of thousands of Greek converts, who very quickly swamped this Jewish heresy, so that it ceased to be a Jewish heresy and became a new and special religion in its own right. Rodney Stark, in his Rise of Christianity, supposes a 40% compound growth in the number of Christians for every decade between the crucifixion and the middle of the 4th century. This is only a supposition, as we haven't the shadow of an ancient statistical survey, but it's not an unreasonable growth. It gives a causal basis to the facts that we do know. Christianity grew and grew and grew and grew. Why did Christianity grow? It grew because it offered things that the pagan cults did not and could not offer. There was, of course, the offer of infinite rewards and infinite punishments. There was the remapping of history as a single story that would lead to a happy ending. There was the intellectual quality of the new faith. By the time of Hadrian, Christianity was attracting to itself a mass of undeniably first-class writers and theologians and philosophers. Robin Lane Fox, not a Christian believer, says, "In the later 2nd and 3rd centuries, most of the best Greek and Latin literature which survives is Christian, and much more has been lost." You don't need to believe that Jesus Christ was the only begotten Son of God, who was sent to suffer for the redemption of our sins. The quality of the faith speaks for itself. It is a faith that begins with a revelation, but then seeks to understand that revelation by a series of rational arguments. You can ask, if God is a benevolent supreme being, how can he allow the existence of evil? The answer? Because God has endowed us with free will and has created the world as a great stage on which we all act under his watchful eye. You ask, so that explains Nero and Domitian, but how about the plagues that swept the world from the time of Marcus Aurelius? They struck down good and bad alike. The answer? Because we must be aware that life is uncertain, and we should not put off those things needed for salvation to a day that will perhaps never come. You ask, how can I know that this God of whom you speak exists? The answer? Oh, that answer involves a library of careful argumentation that culminates, though is not exhausted, in the work of Thomas Aquinas. Beginning with Justin Martyr, who lived in the time of Hadrian, we have a series of great theologians and philosophers, all trying in various ways to explain faith in terms of reason. But Christianity is not only a faith for theologians and philosophers. It is a faith that reaches out to the masses. It speaks to the masses in the language of the masses, and with a burning urgency that cannot be ignored. Let me quote this from Tertullian, the first of the great Latin Christians. That last, that eternal day of judgment, that day which the Gentiles never believed would come, that day they laughed at, when this old world and all its generations shall be consumed in one fire. How vast the spectacle that day, and how wide! What sight shall wake my wonder, what my laughter, my joy and exultation, as I see all those kings, those great kings welcomed, we were told, in heaven, along with Jove, along with those who told of their ascent, groaning in the depths of darkness, and the magistrates who persecuted the name of Jesus, liquefying in fiercer flames than they kindled in their rage against the Christians. Those sages too, the philosophers blushing before their disciples as they blazed together, the disciples whom they taught that God was concerned with nothing, that men have no souls at all, or that what souls they have shall never return to their former bodies, And then the poets trembling before the judgment seat, not of Rhadamanthus, not of Minos, but of Christ, whom they never looked to see. And then there will be the tragic actors to be heard, more vocal in their own tragedy, and the players to be seen, lither of limb than far in the fire. And then the charioteer to watch, red all over in the wheel of flame, and next the athletes to be gazed upon, not in their gymnasiums, but hurled in the fire. Unless it be that not even then would I wish to see them, in my desire rather to turn an insatiable gaze on them who vented their rage and fury on the Lord. There's nothing charitable about this, I agree, but it is memorable, even more so in Latin, and Tertullian has been called the greatest Latin rhetorician beside only Cicero. If Christian writers found it useful to make some concession to the artificial styles of the second sophistic, it wasn't for writing pretty epigrams or silly speeches their supposed deliverers would have found risible. The Christian writers always had something to say, and they normally said it with memorable force. The first response of the imperial government was contempt, and then horror, and then persecution. There is a 19th century representation of how the Christians were persecuted, and if a fanciful representation, each of the individual elements in that representation is evidenced by the literary sources. This is what happened. But the persecution laws were a failure. Christianity grew and grew. The pagans looked at the new faith. They were disdainful. They were bewildered. They were alarmed. At last they were converted. But they were not converted until after a long and increasingly desperate resistance. And there is the end of my digression, I think. But was it a digression? It's brought me exactly to where I wanted to be. I was discussing why the cult of Antinous continued after Hadrian's death, and asking what Athanasius meant when he insisted that the worship continued into the 4th century out of fear. We are now in a better position to answer these partly connected questions. Before I try for an answer, though, we need to go back one step and ask why Antinous was declared a god in the first place. An obvious answer is that Hadrian loved him, that he was so upset by the death that he put him among the gods and filled the world with his images. That is possible. We can take the darker view that Hadrian in some way procured the death. After that, he may have gone through the promise he made as the boy obligingly stepped off the boat into the Nile, or he may have changed his mind about the sacrifice and begun the new worship as a megalomaniac apology. All this, and any permutation of it, is possible, but there is another possibility. The modern followers of Antinous mostly agree that Hadrian was a perfectly saintly lover. They tend also to go further in asserting that he was one of the nicer emperors in the personal sense. The truth appears to be that he was as ruthless and cold-hearted as anyone else who ever held power for any time in an authoritarian but meritocratic system of rule. Here is what was said of him. Here is what was said of Hadrian. Just before his death, he compelled Servianus, then 90 years old, to kill himself, as has been said before, in order that Servianus might not outlive him and, as he thought, become emperor. He likewise gave orders that very many others who were guilty of slight offences should be put to death. These, however, were spared by Antoninus, his successor. Much was said against him after his death, and by many persons. The Senate wished to annul his acts. and would have refrained from naming him the deified had not Antoninus requested it. That's from the Historia Augusta again. Hadrian was not a particularly nice man. No one could deny, though, his devotion to the empire that he ruled. I have said he spent most of his reign on the road, visiting almost every province in turn, correcting abuses, firming its defence, that sort of thing. More than any other emperor of the 2nd century, he must have been aware of the empire's lack of any unifying principle. There is no evidence that he actively persecuted the church, but before arriving in Egypt, he had crushed a Jewish revolt, after which he persecuted those Jews who seemed likely to renew their nation's rejection of the empire as their legitimate overlord. Bearing in mind how, despite their exponential growth, they were still an inconsiderable minority, he may have regarded Christians as the dissident and troublesome Jews that they still were in the apostolic age. His empire had no bond of nationality or language. The firmness of Jewish resistance, however, may have impressed on him still further the understanding that religion, presented in just the right form, could supply the lack of any other unifying principle. Here, I appreciate I'm lapsing into the same wild speculations of others who've written on Antinous. But have another look at Dio Cassius. The youth had voluntarily undertaken to die, it being necessary that a life should be surrendered freely for the accomplishment of the ends Hadrian had in view. What were these ends? We could go again to Aurelius Victor, who says they were connected with his own survival. Or could Hadrian have had a much more ambitious end in mind? Or perhaps Hadrian didn't have this ambitious end explicitly in mind. Perhaps it was an end which only emerged after the act, which is something that very often happens in these matters. Imagine this. Imagine someone who was born in human form into humble circumstances, or into reasonably humble circumstances, but he died while young, a willing victim. He was then raised to heaven and enthroned in glory, a personal comfort and saviour to all who will believe. He is a worker of continuing miracles. Unlike other possible candidates, this saviour didn't live in the impossibly distant past, but at a time reasonably close to the present. He is a saviour who can inspire passionate devotion in those who choose to follow him. Now, the faith of the saviour on the left of the slide is fully integrated into the dominant culture of the empire. It's no threat to the established order. It is indeed a legitimizing force for the emperor who brought it into being, for that emperor and for his heirs and successors by law appointed. The faith of the saviour on the right is no convinced enemy of the dominant culture, but it does reserve the right to choose which parts of that culture it will turn to its own purposes. It is also no respecter of persons. Is this what Hadrian intended? If it is, leave aside partisan considerations of blasphemy. He was a monster to cajole that boy to step into the Nile. He saw the potential of those beautiful statues. He knew what stories to weave about them. Antinous was getting past it as the Greeks viewed such matters. Hadrian was absolute master of an empire filled with younger, if perhaps less beautiful flesh. The real soul within that lovely form had as little meaning to him as any of the other lives he had snuffed out and would continue snuffing out. Remember, that city near the place of the death did go up with suspicious rapidity. It may have been traced out and founded within days. All those statues and other aids to worship spread across the empire with smooth efficiency. But even if that wasn't what happened, and we're not obliged to think the worst of Hadrian, there is the possibility of what the management textbooks call a revealed strategy. Perhaps what happened on that cruise up the Nile is a mystery beyond all unravelling. It is a death on the Nile without any Hercule Poirot to explain clues that, in any event, appear to have been suppressed. By the end of the 2nd century, though, Christianity was a known threat to the cultural and religious order that Hadrian and those like him were determined to preserve unchanged. Ends that Hadrian himself may not have had explicitly in mind were reasonably possible to have come into later minds. The worship of Antinous was partly a spontaneous enthusiasm. We have all the evidence we need for that claim. It may, or must, also have been continued as a deliberate act of state. When Athanasius spoke of a worship maintained by fear, we can perhaps take that as a reference to a continued establishment and promotion. Antinous was an alternative Christ. Even after the Roman authorities disestablished all other faiths but Christianity, Constantine did that in the early 4th century, there were, as we've seen, those who continued his worship all the way to 391 AD, when Theodosius the Great compelled all the pagan temples to close their doors, and he abolished all the pagan sacrifices and festivals. The Church Fathers didn't like Antinous. They didn't like him because of the unprocreated sex, but they mostly didn't like him because he was a created rival to Christ. He was a competitor, and that is why there is so much about Antinous in the writings of the Church Fathers. There is more written about Antinous than about some of the Olympian gods. Look indeed at what Origen of Alexandria has to say about him in the 3rd century. They, the Egyptians, set up in particular places demons with the power to utter oracles or to heal, who often even inflict pain on people who appear to have broken some rule about impure food or about touching a dead person's body, that they may be able to frighten the uneducated masses. Such is the character also of him, Antinous that is, who is thought to be a god in Antinopolis in Egypt. Many of the other gods were dismissed as a simple fraud on the gullible. For Antinous, Origen goes out of his way to accept the reality of the miracles worked in Antinopolis. His only argument is that they are satanic deception. But the Church won. All of organised paganism was abolished at a stroke. The worship of Antinous shared in the general shipwreck, and here are some of the shattered and defaced monuments that testify to the triumph of the Church. We have a bust of Germanicus, a cross carved on its forehead. We have an Egyptian relief, all scratched out by Christian converts, a turning away from the old path towards the new. Coming towards the end, I have answered the main part of the question I set myself, or I have at least outlined the known and probable facts on which we can raise the questions. I've explained what little we know of who Antinous was and of what happened with him after his death. I've speculated on the reasons for what happened. But if this is one of my longer and more monstrously involved lectures, there is more to be said. The temples and worship of Antinous crumbled with the final triumph of the church. His statue at Delphi was pulled down and smashed sometime in the later 4th century. Even if it was set up again by his continuing worshippers, the whole temple complex was soon abandoned and gradually buried. But this was not the end of Antinous. The literature of Rome never ceased to be copied and studied throughout the Middle Ages, or those parts of the literature that survived the crash of ancient civilization in the 6th century AD. But there was limited interest in the material remains of antiquity. From the middle of the 14th century, though, interest began to grow in Italy. By the 16th century, we have the beginnings of a crude archaeology. Statues were dug out of the earth where they'd been thrown down or simply fallen. They were dug out and cleaned, and often repaired. They began to fill the museums of Rome and Italy, where they could be admired and copied, and where they could inspire original, fresh creations. Until a time well within living memory, Antinous was seen as a difficult exhibit. As said, many museums preferred to keep his images in what may be called an artistic closet. But this was a response that gathered force only towards the end of the 19th century. All through the later Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the response was greatly more appreciative. On the right of this slide, you can see from 1520 Lorenzetto's Jonah, based on a drawing by Raphael. Now, do you recognise that head, and in some degree that body? That's Antinous, isn't it? On the left, we have from 1630 Pietro Taccia's Antinous. The discovery of original statues was always a time of celebration among collectors, and vast sums were lavished on acquiring them. Part of the reasons Berlin has so many statues is because, mean though he was in all other matters not military, Frederick the Great could barely keep his wallet closed when something of Antinous came on the market. Yes, Frederick the Great had a side to his personality that writers on military history often choose to overlook, or of which they are simply not aware. But here is Winckelmann, the great critic of the 18th century, on the Antinous Mondragone. The glory and crown of the art of the age, as well as any other, it is the most beautiful work that has come down to us. A considered opinion by a man of considerable reputation. Coming into the 19th century, we have a mass of tortured and guilty appreciation by men of a certain inclination. These are among the writings that until recently helped determine our view of Antinous. They include reams of comically unreadable verse, but we also have Tennyson on the bust that I photographed in the British Museum. Ah, this is the inscrutable Bithynian. If we knew what he knew, we should understand the ancient world. That's what Tennyson said in the British Museum about 150 years ago, when he came face to face with the bust of Antinous that I photographed there a few weeks ago. Coming into our own time, there is that wonderful novel by Marguerite Yourcenar. You can take issue with the tone of the novel, but it is a masterpiece. I say that as a man who's written 14 historical novels. I do know what I'm talking about when it comes to historical fiction, and this is a masterpiece. If you read nothing else on the list I give at the end of these slides, do read the Memoirs of Hadrian. Do read them in English translation or in the French original. Or there's the opera Hadrian by Rufus Wainwright. I can't say I liked that opera. I listened to the premiere and I have a recording of it on one of my many hard discs, but I've never felt inclined to listen to it again. I'll allow that the Act 2 entr'acte is passably good. You can listen to it yourself. You can find it on YouTube, and I've given a link here on the slide. Yes, do have a look at it. Just because I didn't think much of it is no reason why you shouldn't. It may be a perfectly good piece of music. It just isn't to my rather restricted taste. Or here is a spray-painted graffito near Frankfurt. It doesn't say Antinous, but everyone knows it's Antinous because the face of Antinous is nowadays everywhere. I've never tried this, but don't let me dissuade you from the experiment. Go into any city centre, not excepting a city in China, show pictures of Antinous and ask who he is. I suspect you'll be surprised by the extent of recognition. I suspect Antinous is almost as well known now as he was in the time of Hadrian. I suspect he is better known than Hadrian himself. Some faint justice, I feel obliged to add. Then you have a modern worship of Antinous the god. He's part of the pagan revival of the past few generations. I've given you 2 of the websites, but there are others. Since paganism is by its nature diverse and decentralized, there's no equivalent of a church of Antinous. You may suspect he is worshipped less for his alleged divinity than for his undoubted appearance. But I have corresponded with devotees of his revived worship, and I have no reason to doubt if their devotion is genuine. And Antinous continues to be big business. Original images from the time of Hadrian, and somewhat after, command immense amounts of money in the auction houses. Here's the Mantinean coin I showed earlier. This isn't an inch across, and it went for £22,000. Or, if you can't easily run to that sort of money, you can have a modern reproduction. Can't say much about these reproductions. They're not particularly good. That copy on the left is a bust of Antinous. It's copied from a bust found in Syria, and it doesn't look much like Antinous. There's something wrong with the face. The statue on the right, I suppose, is an imitation of the body from Delphi, but the face is less than convincing. Yes, the face is somewhat less than convincing. Time, though, for a conclusion. What shall I say for a conclusion? The story of Antinous is one of the strangest that we have from the ancient world. I have denied that the statues show any particular sadness, but thinking of the boy from Bithynia always leaves me, at least, with a moderate sadness. I've heard it said that he was lucky to die when he did, before his looks could begin to fade. I find that a most heartless observation. Regardless of its beauty, that body carried an immortal soul, and the function of a body is to enable the soul to work out its proper end. I've lived more than 3 times longer than Antinous did, and I could happily live 3 times longer than that, working out my own designs to something that approaches their proper end. Would Antinous have been so unhappy if Hadrian had grown tired of him and sent him back to Claudiopolis, there to work out his reasonable life expectancy as a gentleman farmer, fussing over land boundaries and marriage portions for his daughters? I don't think he would have been at all unhappy, but he never had that chance. And I am finally sad rather than angry if I suspect that such a chance was denied him by design. But, as usual when I start talking, I've gone on and on and on. I could say much more than I have, but I have filled up most of the time set aside for this lecture. If I've rambled somewhat, I can't say I've left out any of what should be the main points. If you're interested in reading more about Antinous, here is a fairly decent bibliography of some of the sources that I've consulted, and you'll find other suggestions in the bibliographies to those books and articles. But this is all I will say. Was that all right? And does anybody have any questions? Oh, I can see I have a whole mountain of the things. Let's make a start. Let me move to